Demography is the elephant in the room, or rather it's not even the elephant in the room, it's the elephant that most politicians don't realise is there.
Japan has chosen, it has very low immigration levels, not zero, but low. At the same time, Japan has been a world leader in small family size. It's had below replacement fertility, fewer than 2.1 children per woman, and actually well below that for most of the last 50 years. And its Prime Minister has talked about civilizational collapse.
In the next few years, we'll see no natural increase in the British population.
British politics is caught between the right who want lower taxes, the left who want more spending. But the truth is that we can't have lower taxes or more spending if we don't have a workforce going through. That's nothing to do with politics or ideology, that is just the facts.
The idea of the trilemma is you can have two but not all three. You can have small families, you can have economic dynamism, and you can have low immigration. You can have two but not three of those things. There is a trade-off between them.
I think when you have half the population that don't come to that country...
what are they integrating into?
What are they integrating into? An airport.
The vast majority of the population who do want children, how does government, how does society, how does culture help those dreams come true? Because that's what we're talking about. It is a huge source of personal grief for people who find themselves childless when they didn't wish to be. We're sitting here with Philip Pilkington and Paul Morland, who've produced this report, and they will talk about it in more depth shortly. But it is a fascinating report, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, actually. And although it is a question I'm very interested in, there's plenty of new information in there that I don't think actually anybody else has produced. And I think the reason why this is so important is that in Western politics, particularly in British politics, demography is the elephant in the room, or rather it's not even the elephant in the room, it's the elephant that most politicians don't realise is there. And I think what this paper encapsulates so brilliantly is what a serious economic issue we have with declining birth rates. And I think at the moment, British politics is caught between the right who want lower taxes, the left who want more spending. But the truth is that we can't have lower taxes or more spending if we don't have a workforce going through. That is just, it's nothing to do with politics or ideology. That is just the facts. And I think until we realise that and start to be able to have this discussion in the UK, we are not going to be able to find solutions, let alone realise the seriousness of this problem. But of course, there are difficulties politically in talking about this issue because there's something that you need to produce babies, and that's women. And we are very keen, rightly so, not to tell women to have children if they don't want to, although, of course, actually, it's only the tiny minority of women that don't want to have children. So this is a big issue for politicians. What do we do about demography that doesn't sound chauvinistic or it doesn't sound like going back to the 1950s? How do we encourage people who want to have children to do so? How do we get the barriers out of the way? What are the politics of that? What are the economics of that? But in the very first instant, we've actually got to realise we have a problem, and I don't think we're there yet.
And it is interesting, too, that many other countries are quite open about pursuing pronatalist policies. That's across Europe, across Asia. And it does seem that in the Anglo countries, there's this special shyness about that. But anyway, I want to now go on to the report, which we have a number of copies of here. People will have seen that, and the authors are with us, Paul Morland and Philip Pilkington. Paul, do you want to start things off telling us a little bit about the report?
So the essence of the report is what I call the demographic trilemma, which is something that I wrote about in my most recent book, Tomorrow's People. The idea of the trilemma is you can have two, but not all three, of the following things. You can have small families, you can have economic dynamism, and you can have low immigration, ethnic continuity, if you like. You can have two, but not three of those things. There is a trade-off between them. And I think we are much better off as a society and politically if we understand those trade-offs. And the examples I give of those trade-offs are three countries. In Japan, they are unashamed about talking about ethnic continuity. The term itself is something problematic for people in Europe. But in Japan, in Korea, in much of East Asia and other parts of the world, they are happy to say we have a preference for ethnic continuity, a continuity of the people in this country, and a limited immigration. And that's what Japan has chosen. It has very low immigration levels, not zero, but low, a low level of foreign population as a share of the total. At the same time, Japan has been a world leader in small family size. It's had below replacement fertility, fewer than 2.1 children per woman, and actually well below that for most of the last 50 years. The result is, having chosen small families, and having chosen ethnic continuity, Japan cannot have a dynamic economy. Its economy, which was once the poster child of the developing world, has had much slower growth in the last 35 years than it had in the previous 35 years. It has a huge debt to GDP ratio because its government has too few workers and too many older people needing care and needing pensions. And its prime minister has talked about civilizational collapse. So it chooses those two, and it suffers on the third dimension. The UK, by contrast, wishes to keep the lights on. It wishes to keep its economy ticking over, not that successfully, but where there are labour shortages, it responds to those labour shortages and feels we need workers to undertake those tasks. And at the same time, although fertility has not been as low as in Japan, Britain has also had 50 years, 2 generations of below replacement fertility rate. And the result is that Britain cannot have, for want of a better term, ethnic continuity. Britain needs, if it wants those two things, if it wants small families and a buoyant economy, it needs to have mass immigration. And those who complain about mass immigration, I think, would be better to understand why it is that despite the promises of government, nevertheless immigration has been so high. The only example in the developed world which has chosen the third point on the axis is Israel. In Israel, women have around 3 children each. That's a whole child plus more than any OECD country. Israel now, although of course it's built on Jewish immigration, it now has lower immigration than the OECD average, and yet it can keep its economy ticking over. It's had a very successful economy, largely because it has a fresh inflow of workers much larger than those leaving the labour force. So that's been Israel's choice. The question really then was, what are the trade-offs like? If we wanted to stop immigration in the UK, say, and we wanted to keep the family sizes as small as they are, just how bad would the dependency ratio go? And if, on the other hand, we wanted to say, we'll keep having immigration to keep the dependency ratio level without a fertility rate increase, just how high does immigration have to go? And if we want to do neither of those things, how much does our fertility need to increase? And that's where I work with Philip, who has helped model this and can give us the answers to those questions.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, as you said, we kind of took the 3 countries, Japan, Britain, and Israel, as models, as it were, and said we basically, because we're in the UK, obviously, we took the UK data currently, and we said, okay, well, what will happen if Britain follows one of these 3 models? Now, just to emphasise, I know we're saying we're using the British data. I don't think the results for this will be vastly different in most Western countries. They have similar birth rates, they have similar needs with regards to dependency ratio, and they have similar problems with immigration. So I guess we can start with, for those watching the video, they'll see this chart. This is the UK population change going back through time. And what we see is the blue area there is the natural increase in the population. That's births minus deaths. And then the orange is net migration. So if you're not replacing yourself with having more births than deaths, then you need to import immigrants. Otherwise, your population will shrink. And what people will notice is that in 2020, we saw for the first time that the natural increase in the population, that is births minus deaths, was basically zero. The domestic population was not growing. Now, that was partly due to COVID and the higher than average death rates, but we're getting there pretty soon. In the next few years, we'll see no natural increase in the British population. The next slide, I'm not going to show all of the models. If people are interested, I'd encourage them to read the paper, but just to kind of give a kind of a flavour of the work we've done, the next slide shows mass migration. This is a mass migration model. So this is if Britain carries on basically with a low fertility rate, wanting to keep the economy running as it currently is, to the extent that it is, and allow basically immigration to plug the gap. In this, now we've done a variety of models on this. In this, we've assumed that British birth rates gradually fall towards South Korean birth rates. We think that there's good evidence that might happen. You can read the paper if you want to understand that evidence better. And basically, the outcome that you get is by the early 2080s, about half the population in Britain is firstborn migrants. Now, just to emphasise, we say in the paper we don't make any assumptions about integration, about second generation immigrants, people who are born in the country, whose parents are immigrants. We just assume they're native population in a sense. So we're talking about foreign born people here. We're talking about people from another country who very likely speak a different language and so on. So these are enormous rates. I mean, it's you don't really need to emphasize that a population with half of that population not actually coming from that country. I mean, I don't think it's ever really been tried in history outside of maybe early colonial projects in Australia or something, maybe early Israel might be an example, but into a developed country that has a history and so on, I think these are very high rates. The next chart shows the economic stagnation model. So this is what would happen if Britain followed the Japanese path. They said, we're not going to get the birth rate up, or we can't get the birth rate up, but we want to restrict immigration because we don't want these enormous first-generation migrant numbers. And what we see is that the dependency ratio, and that's basically the number of workers per the number of old people, climbs absolutely enormous, reaching up near to 50%. So you nearly get 1-to-1 in a sense. And if this happens, I mean, Paul's already talked about that Japan's experiencing economic stagnation, but it also comes with other problems, like who's going to take care of these old people? How much of the labor force that we have is going to have to be basically allocated to a care home economy? These are enormous questions, and they go far beyond the general discussion of how we fund pensions. Also important, but it completely affects the economy at all levels. So then finally, we've tried in the final slide. We've tried the Israel model. Effectively, we've assumed that somehow Britain has managed to get its fertility rate up, perhaps through aggressive pronatal policies, and assuming that they work. And what we see is that the old age dependency ratio declines, and we already have probably too high an old age dependency ratio in this country, and that comes down. So I think, the exercise really is just to model these outcomes, but I think we're implicitly assuming that if we want to continue on robust and dynamic economic growth, and we think 50% of the population being firstborn migrants is too high, then we probably have to get the birth rates up. There's no real alternative.
On that, there's a couple of questions that this raises. One is, can we just focus on the amount of, essentially the foreign-born share that you referred to in 2080? That's not descendants of the foreign-born. That is literally people who have arrived in the country who are born in another country. So if you and of course, if we actually bring in the descendants, say the second generation, third generation of people who were immigrants, that number is going to be a very clear majority of the population, right? And so, to the extent that there is also an issue perhaps with second or third generation not being completely exactly integrated, then the problem is going to be even bigger. You might even be understating the integration.
People at that point can accurately describe themselves as white British, which is a flexible category. I myself, I'm in a family where some of us do and some of us don't. But those who can describe themselves as white British will be a very small minority. Half the population is first born outside the country, but after years and years of mass immigration. The other problem, of course, and maybe you'll have some things to say on that, Philip, but the other problem is that lots of other countries will be competing for those immigrants. More and more of the world is falling into a sub-replacement fertility space. So we'll have more and more countries requiring the immigrants from fewer and fewer countries. And ultimately, it is unsustainable, because what we're saying is more and more of humanity is having very small families, wanting to keep its dependency ratio as a country stable, and sucking in from the rest of the world those few countries where they are having more children. Well, that's not going, by the 2080s, you can wonder whether anywhere is going to be having surplus.
I'd add to that very briefly. We haven't looked at the second generation impact, but presumably, if you have a society that's able to integrate people, you probably want a fairly large domestic base of people who come from that country. I think when you have half the population that don't come to that country, integration becomes, logically speaking,
what are they integrating into?
What are they integrating into? An airport.
And there's also obviously the politics of national populism, both historically and in the United States, for example. When the foreign-born share reached sort of 12, 13%, you got, the politics of 1920s America, which was very much the anti-Catholic, restrictionist, nativist politics, and we're seeing that now across the West. So the idea that we could actually double that share and not see some kind of response is probably fanciful. But Miriam, you wanted to come in, I think, on one.
Yes, I was just going to come in on Paul's point about that we need some sort of economic attractiveness in order to get these vast numbers of people to come over here. And by 2080, what are the chances of that still being the case? We've already seen, for example, from Eastern Europe, and again pointed out brilliantly in the paper, that there was a special moment when, if you like, the communist bloc collapsed and a number of highly educated but essentially poor migrants came from Eastern Europe, and they were our source of immigration for a long time. But you look at the Polish economy now, it's doing very well. It's very much approaching our own GDP per capita. There's obviously Brexit has also happened, but there's much less pull from people of those countries to come to the UK now.
Polish fertility.
And Polish fertility rates are falling. But then you look at other countries that at the moment are supplying us with a lot of immigrant labour. But I think only 2% of the world's population now live in countries where the birth rate is not falling. So we have a very time-limited window in which we will have immigrants. So really, although the economic stagnation, the massive migration model is frightening in the sense of, what would be the democratic outcome of this, it's actually probably unlikely, because we just won't be able to find these immigrants from anywhere, because nobody will have spare population, or no spare young population anyway. So really that does mean that the economic stagnation model is the most likely if we don't change fertility rate. And that is extremely frightening, because if you think the whole of the Western world has suddenly got this enormous, inverted population pyramid where the old vastly outweigh the young. And I think the other thing on that is that we are assuming that fertility rates will fall gradually as they are continuing to do so. What happens when it's no longer the norm to have a child? So at the moment, you've still got most women have children. Will it then collapse far more quickly because it's culturally unacceptable, culturally not normal to start a family?
I think our feeling is sort of, we take South Korea as that effective outcome. Could it get worse than South Korea? Maybe, but it's 0.8 children per woman, right? So, and 2.1 is obviously the replacement. So we take South Korea as that model. We model it as if we gradually get there by 2080. But I think, Paul, maybe you can speak to it. The early indicators seem to suggest, as you are alluding to, it's generational and it'll actually be a cliff.
So if we look at the generation coming through now, we see extremely low fertility in Generation Z. Now, that could partly be that we know fertility is being delayed, but it's kind of falling off a cliff in the UK at the moment. Now, that it could all be made up later on, but the earlier indications are not only that Generation Z are having very few children, but their values and their lifestyle and their aspirations do not correlate with having large numbers of children. To pick up on what Eric and Miriam said, Eric effectively said there'll be a political limit to how much immigration you can have because of the rise of the populist right. And Miriam said there'll more or less be a demographic limit because lots of countries are simply not having that many children. So I think we do then end up in a world of frighteningly high dependency ratios. And I'd just like to throw this in. When Japan reached 100 million people back in the 1960s, it had 5 to 6 people of working age for every retiree. And the population went up and then it went down. It will be back at 100 million sometime in the 2030s or 2040s. And people might say, oh, it was 100 million on the way up, it'll be 100 million on the way down. What's the big difference? Instead, when it on the way down, when Japan reaches 100 million people, instead of having 5 to 6 workers for everyone of retirement age, they'll have fewer than 1 worker for everyone of retirement age. So you can move the retirement age, and of course you probably should. We know it's very difficult. Putin tried and failed. Macron tried and failed, but it can be done by a few years. But to think that shifting the retirement age by a few years is going to make a significant impact on that shift from a 5 or 6 to 1, when Japan was a booming economy back in the 60s, and a less than 1 to 1, which is going to be in the 2030s and 2040s, is very wishful thinking.
Yeah, I think it's worth just really quickly emphasising the retirement age thing, because that seems to be the catch-all solution. When you bring up this topic, politicians say, oh, we need to, and it's a great issue because it's so hard to get done. So, you can just keep at it, hacking away, oh, we can't get it done, we can't get it done. But the point is, from a modelling perspective, it's boring to get into, but it only gives you a step increase. It's not a permanent solution. It's not a rate of change, as it were. And the second thing I'd say is, show us the proof. Show us the country that solved their demographic problem by raising the retirement.
Well, the higher the retirement age, the greater the chance of you not being fit to work at that. So at that age, so each year you increase it by, you have a fewer percentage of people who can actually keep going to that age. So
and there's another subtle effect, possibly. I mean, it's hard to model, which is the later you retire, the less likely you are to be able to help your children with their children. And one correlation that appears to be the case is grandparental help. I speak as a recent grandparent myself. It makes a real difference. So when my wife and I give help to our children in looking after their children, we're hoping that that makes that incremental extra child a little bit less difficult, a little bit less daunting. But if you're actually slaving away yourself at work all the time and unable to give that help, that will have perhaps a modest impact of further depressing the burden.
But let me try and play a bit of the devil's advocate here, because that's always more fun. But so Vegard Skirbeck, demographer, would argue that if you take an 80-year-old in Norway, they have the same cognitive capacity as a sort of 53, 54-year-old in China. Our seniors are just much healthier, better educated. They're going to be productive longer in non-manual employment. So having an older population in the 2020s doesn't mean the same thing as having an older population in the 1950s. So actually, it's not as big a deal. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, part of this, of course, is because there's obviously a debate. You have a lot of countries saying we need immigration because we got to solve the aging problem. One of the arguments against that might be to say, well, with this more healthy and educated senior population, we can actually be productive, who can be productive longer. We don't necessarily need to bring that immigration in, partly because immigrants age as well. And so all we're doing is kicking the can down the road by bringing in immigrants that we're going to have to pay for when they retire. And then they're going to, are we going to keep going on with this Ponzi scheme? What are your thoughts just on whether today's seniors can be productive, at least in white-collar occupations, in those kinds of economies that we're in?
Only if you're the president of the United States.
I would say, actually, having worked in finance, there's actually a problem with getting people who hold on to companies for too long. It's actually kind of an issue. But beyond that, without making a value judgment, I just think it needs to be emphasized. Like, when you work through the model, it becomes very clear that a few extra years in the labor force just isn't going to make that much of a difference in terms of the overall structure. And I think people can kind of imagine that if we're talking about an economy where you have one retiree for every worker, I mean, at what point do we have the 75-year-old looking after the 76-year-old? It becomes a little bit ridiculous at some point. I don't know if you've thought.
Well, again, I think, it certainly will help a little bit on the margins, but to think that changing the retirement age is going to compensate from having 5 or 6 workers to one to having 1-to-1 is naive. I think that there is huge political resistance. We know people set their expectations as when they want to retire. And I also think there's the grandparental point. There's also the point that the workplace is not very friendly to older people, and that can be changed on the margin, of course. But in your 60s and 70s, to be working in the city, in finance, in a manual job, there are all sorts of jobs, whether it's moving an old person, helping him or her go to the loo and getting him or her to eat, or whether it's working in a hedge fund, or lots and lots of jobs in between, medical jobs. There are so many jobs where really, realistically, you might be able to shift it a few years. I honestly don't think people in their 70s and 80s in those kinds of jobs is realistic. And what we have found is certainly that people lived longer and that they have longer, healthy lives and that they're more educated, they're more likely to have had tertiary education and so on. I just don't think that can remotely compensate for the fact that you're going from a 5 or 6-to-1 to a 1-to-1, and it's really hard to do.
Well, what about, I'm again being devil's advocate, AI and robotics technologies as replacements for labor, whether that be, we know in Japan, the care robots or AI replacing large numbers of people. I mean, is that in any way possibly a solution for the lack of workers, particularly young workers? I don't know.
I've been thinking a lot about that because I wrote a chapter in my next forthcoming book, which is Procreate or Perish. And my sense is the following. We know since the Luddites in the early 19th century, people have expected technology to move in and remove jobs. And if you'd said to someone around 1800, by now, by 2023, 3-4% of the workforce is going to be working in agriculture, they would have looked at you as if you were mad and said, well, that's What else is there to do? The odd doctor, the odd lawyer, the odd clergy person. And if you'd said, 50, 60, 80 years ago, that only a few percentage points of people were working in manufacturing, the answer would be, well, no one's working in the agricultural industry. We are amazingly effective at creating the need for labour. And in my book, I quote the LinkedIn page of my son-in-law, who's in high tech, and I honestly have no idea the point of quoting. So we're always creating new needs for labour, and we've always got technology. So on the one hand, on the frontier, forward frontier, we're creating new demands for labour. And on the back side of the frontier, we're using technology to reduce the demand for labour. And the two always balance out. Given the sort of economy we have today, which has not much agriculture, not much industry, it's very service heavy. Whether you're talking about the brain surgeon or you're talking about the bin man, it's really hard to see AI replacing a lot of that labour. Now, it certainly will replace some of it. There's no doubt, as technology has always replaced labour. But it's not clear to me that the sort of economy we're developing with growing demands for labour, particularly in elder care. In Japan, for example, they have robots to help look after old people, and apparently they've given up on them. By the time you've trained someone, you've plugged it in, you've plugged it out, you put it away. It's honestly not. So I'm not saying technology will not help, as it always has, replace the requirement for labour. But I'm deeply unconvinced that we're suddenly going to find this is the breakthrough. So I would add to that, we're not seeing great gains in productivity in the data, something Philip understands better than I do. If we were on the cusp of a world of massive change like this, we'd either see the same economy with half the people and mass unemployment and huge productivity gains with all the problems, or we'd have the same people working and twice the size of it, because that is productivity. We're not seeing productivity gains, which suggests that this isn't really happening yet. So I'm skeptical, and I'll just close with the comment, ChatGPT, fix my tap, take mum to a doctor's appointment, retile my roof. There are so many things we need labour for, and increasingly actually in the economy, as technology has picked a lot of that stuff up. And ChatGPT may have some useful suggestions, but it ain't going to do it. Philip?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to highlight productivity here. Economists have a way to measure the impact of technology on the economy, and it's labour productivity effectively. How many things, how many widgets of output can you produce? And if you're doing it by hand, you can do one. You get a machine and you can do 100. We can measure that, right? So a couple of things to say about it. Well, first of all, there's a very famous quote from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solov, who's the kind of founder of productivity studies in the 1960s. And in the 1990s, late 1990s, during the dot-com bubble, while it was still raging, and after the enormous expansion of technology into offices in the 1980s and 1990s, Robert Solov said, you can see the technology revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics. It didn't show up. Now, why? It's called the productivity puzzle in economics. It's well known. We're not going to do a podcast on the productivity puzzle, but I'm just saying economists have long said, wow, there's a lot of fax machines popping up. There's a lot of phones. Internet pops up. And the productivity, it just doesn't show up in the productivity numbers. As you alluded to, productivity is a huge problem right now. Especially Britain, but other countries as well, have seen enormous declines in productivity since 2008, 2009. We don't fully understand why that is, but it's happening. And that leads to kind of the last point. Look, there's only one path forward here, right? And if we go down the, well, AI will solve it route, what we're doing is we're making a massive bet that we can't take back on something that's never worked before, okay? So we're saying, so somebody can come out and they can show me all the gadgets and they can show me all the AI and the amazing statistical programs behind AI. But I say, I've never seen this increase productivity, like massively before. Obviously, it incrementally increases productivity all the time, has since the Industrial Revolution. We've never seen this revolution that you're talking about. You're promising it's going to happen. And if we rely on that and you're wrong, we can't put the reset button. It's not a video game, okay? You can't press reset on this one. If we get it wrong, we end up in the kind of hell economy that we're modeling, a really stagnant economy with a lot of social problems potentially, and we can't turn the clock back. So it's a bet that we're making, and we need to be really, really cognizant.
And I think you can't make the assumption that particularly care, so elderly care, childcare, it's not fungible. It matters who does it or what does it. And if we learn anything from COVID, is that isolation is absolutely terrible for human psychology. And the idea that somebody in their 80s receiving care from a robot, it will be equivalent to receiving care from your own child or grandchild. I mean, it's just for the birds. It's exactly the same with childcare. You know, for a baby of one, mum is not equivalent to a daycare worker. Those two things just aren't the same. And I think the problem with this essentially economic issue is that the answers are not purely economic. This isn't about who should supply our energy, where do we get the best source of energy in the future. You know, this is about making babies. And that's not something that economists can just sit there. So if you pull this lever, it really is. It's a cultural, a psychological issue. And this is why I come back to this idea that if it no longer becomes the norm to have children, then we are in deep trouble, because there's a big difference between, you know, I had my first child at 25. There's a big difference between bringing a child into the world at 25 when all your friends are doing it, when there's a baby group every day, when there's plenty of support, when your own parents are young enough to help you look after your child, when everybody in your family is doing the same thing, when you've still got grandparents alive yourself, to bringing a child into the world in your 30s when you know nobody else with the child. There's no other children in the playground. There isn't even actually any childcare anymore because there's no demand for it. But those are two very, very different prospects. And my fear is that unless we reverse this decline rapidly, it will become so culturally unusual to have a child that people will just stop doing it altogether. And I think what's also really interesting in this paper is that even if we did solve this problem now, even if we did somehow enable women to have the number of children that they say they want, because women do actually say they want 2 to 3 children, they just end up having fewer for all these reasons. Even if we solve that today, we're still talking about a considerable lag in the demographic problem. We're still going to have an aging society. We've still got 20 years before any new babies come through into the workforce. But that just adds to the urgency to me. We have got to start talking about solutions. Otherwise, we are going to be no better off in 2050.
Well, on that, and just trying to pick up on that, this whole question then of solutions to now, we have been through a number of decades now of pronatal experimentation in Asia, in Europe. I mean, I remember editing with Brad Wilcox the book on the causes and consequences of low fertility in 2015, and the kind of view then was that all these policies hadn't really worked. It's hard to find a consistent set, particularly the child benefit type incentivization. Doesn't really see, the most you seem to be able to get is maybe a couple of points on the birth rate is about it. Any thoughts on the difficulty of reversing fertility decline? Has any country done it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to say a few things, but I think Philip perhaps knows more about this than me because he spent more time in Hungary than I have. Which Hungary is the country that's tried hardest. In my book, Procreate or Perish, I conclude with a section called Solutions. And the first thing is, what can technology do for us? And I more or less conclude as we have not very much. You tell your mum, I got you the Turing, the version of the robot to look after you that passed the Turing test. I'm just still not very happy. I'm sceptical about AI. I mean, it's wonderful in many ways. It's a challenge. We have all sorts of issues, but will it replace labour? I think in a very limited way. The next chapter is what can government do for us, and the last chapter, what can we do for ourselves? So I think there is a limit to what government can do for us, although a certain amount of experimentation, a certain amount of change of policies. Again, I think Philip knows more about this than I do. But I do ultimately think that whatever government does, if you do not have a culture that is pronatal, how you create such a culture is another question. But if you go to Israel, the passion people have for their families, for their children, and the desire to have children, the normality of having children, is why they have a fertility rate of 3. And if government is going to be doing this in isolation, if society, if culture doesn't change, then I think what government can do is quite limited.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, you mentioned Hungary. Hungary's probably been the most aggressive in trying to get the birth rate up. They've established an actual minister for families, so there's a ministry working day in, day out to try and get the birth rate up. I think the initial results have been pretty promising. The fertility rate's gone up 30%. Some people say some of that is due to regional economic development. I think that's true, but I don't think all of it is. The really striking statistic is the marriage rate has nearly doubled. Now, that is not some outlying factor. That's not some economic growth issue. That is clearly they've incentivized people to get married. And my feeling on that is creating the culture. First normalize people getting married and rather than cohabiting, and then they're probably more likely to have children down the line. We'll see. In a theoretical sense, I know this is kind of a weird thought experiment, but I think it kind of puts people's minds right about this. There is a point at which people can be incentivized to have children. If I offer you £1 million to have a child, you will, if you're married and it's pretty stable, you're obviously going to have a child for £1 million. Now, if I offer everyone £1 million in the UK to have a child, we'll have hyperinflation. Okay, it won't work out very well. So we can't do £1 million per child. But the point is that if it's not 1 million, how much is it? Is it 500,000? Okay, that's too much. Is it 100,000? That's too much. Or is it? I mean, really, if we're talking about such deep economic issues down the line, I don't have a hard and fast rule here, but if we're talking about the kind of economic issues that we're talking about here, which are really desperate, like way worse than most other issues in the economy at the moment, then it might be worth investing substantial amounts of public money into getting this up. The last thing I'd say is, on the cultural front, because I've talked to some young people who are interested in this, it is a kind of a dark vision, but I think it needs to be kind of put out there that in the situation that we're modeling, in a situation where you have very high dependency ratios, my sense is that the care home systems won't be very pleasant places to live. I had a phrase in an article, the care home gulag system, and I know that sounds really grim and dark, but I mean it in a very real way. There'll be a limited amount of resources in society, okay? And so the natural tendency will be to starve the care home sector of those resources. I know it sounds grim, but this is just the logical outcome. The people working and producing the output will say, well, I should get more of that output. And it's a zero-sum game. Now, the reason I highlight that isn't just to kind of give a vision of the demographic apocalypse, although people should think about it, but also if you're young, the way you may be able to save yourself from that is by having children. Because then your children might be able to take care of you outside of what could become a very rough care home system. So I think there's a very strong personal incentive, and we should communicate that to people. We should say, look, this might be tending in a pretty grim direction, and you can kind of save yourself from that and do a social good by trying to start a family and having children.
I think that's fascinating, because one of the objections that people have to the state, the taxpayer, not incentivizing people having children even, but just supporting them to do it, is people say to me, oh, why should I pay for you to have children? Why should I pay for your children to be educated? Why should I pay for your child benefit? But surely the answer is that why should my children support you in your old age? That maybe is the reframing of the question. But I think that's a brilliant point. But just one more thing to add. I think understanding the issue is really important. And the work of Stephen Shaw, who's a data scientist who's based in Japan at the moment and studied this, it suggests that actually the issue is women not having that first child. Once you've got the first child, family size is fairly similar to what it was in the 1970s. So, you can either have 2 or 3 or 4 children, whatever it's going to be. But it's far fewer women having that first child or leaving it later to start trying for a child. And then, of course, you statistically, sadly, got less chance of having it. So I think understanding the problem is this is not just actually about family size per se. It's about the number of women who aren't having, for whatever reason, that first child. And I just want to come back to, because I'm often accused of this, people who say they don't want children are a very small proportion of the population. They absolutely should be respected. There's no reason, this has always been the case. There are people who don't want to have children. That's fine. No problem at all. What we're talking about is the vast majority of the population who do want children, but now for all these different sorts of reasons aren't. And I think the question is, how does government, how does society, how does culture help those dreams come true? Because that's what we're talking about. It's not just an economic problem. It is a huge source of personal grief for people who get to the end of their childbearing years and find themselves childless when they didn't wish to be.